Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us from Florida and around the world for this exciting event with NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. My name is Golfo Alexopoulos, and I'm a professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at the University of South Florida in Tampa Bay. I'm also the director of the USF Institute on Russia, and I will be moderating today's discussion together with my colleague, Dr. Thomas Smith. We are distinctly honored to welcome the NATO Secretary General virtually to USF. Before we begin, I want to thank everyone who helped make this very special event possible. Admiral John Kirby, the Public Diplomacy Division at NATO headquarters, and the College of Arts and Sciences. This event is co-sponsored by the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies and the USF Institute on Russia. And we are deeply grateful to our generous supporters, especially the Institute on Russia's Advisory Council. Now, let's get started. Thomas, over to you.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Thomas Smith. I'm Associate Dean of the Judy Ginshaft Honors College and also a professor in the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies. We are delighted to have you with us for this conversation with the Secretary General as he addresses a range of security issues around the world, but also some that affect us right here in Florida. It is my pleasure to turn things over to the president of the University of South Florida, Stephen Carroll, who will introduce our host, our guest. Dr. Carroll is the 7th president of USF. He joined us in 2019, bringing 3 decades of leadership and academic expertise from top universities, both in the US and abroad. He holds a PhD in organizational psychology from Cornell. He's an expert in innovation, emerging technologies, negotiation, and corporate governance. President Carroll, over to you.
Well, thank you, Thomas, and hello, everybody. On behalf of the University of South Florida, I'm honored to welcome Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to this virtual conversation. And we thank him for joining us today from Brussels. I wish to thank USF's Institute on Russia and our School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies for facilitating this event. Professors Golfo Alexopoulos and Thomas Smith have prepared our students for this exciting opportunity to speak with the Secretary General on a variety of current topics. And for me personally, this is actually the second time that I've had the privilege of being with the Secretary General. In my previous institution, we hosted him for an event with students, and he was brilliant that day, as I'm sure he will be today as well. There could be no better time for us to consider the global landscape. Today, an international system is emerging that's defined by both the great power competition as well as by issues that transcend national borders, such as pandemics, environmental and resource issues, cybersecurity, and disruptive technologies. As the NATO alliance seeks to collaborate on forward-facing solutions, global research universities have an important role to play. At the University of South Florida, our faculty and students are conducting research to improve understanding of an increasingly complex world and to make our world safer and more secure. Now, we offer academic programs in a range of fields and disciplines that impact global security, from cybersecurity to artificial intelligence and international studies to medicine and public health. And we're proud of our partnerships and collaborations too with U.S. Special Operations Command and U.S. Central Command at MacDill Air Force Base. And we're eager to learn more about NATO's 2030 initiative so that we can adapt for the future, a future that will be shaped for and by the students gathered here today. Throughout his distinguished career, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has been a strong advocate for greater global and transatlantic cooperation. He became NATO Secretary General in 2014 after serving as Prime Minister of Norway from 2005 to 2013. He attended the University of Oslo, where he earned an advanced degree in economics, and he worked as a journalist before entering politics as a member of the Norwegian Labour Party. I'm grateful to Secretary General for spending time with us today. We have much to learn from his expertise and his experience. Mr. Secretary General, welcome.
Thanks so much, Stephen. It's great to see you again, and also great to see your colleagues and to be with you all. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm so grateful that you show this interest in NATO, the importance of Europe and North America working together. And I'm here to answer questions and to engage in a conversation with you and the students. So once again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Secretary General Stoltenberg. I'd like to start with our first question here to get us all started. You have had a very busy week. You hosted all the NATO foreign ministers this week, and you met the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken for the first time. What, in your view, was the most significant outcome of this meeting with Secretary Blinken?
So first of all, it was a very good meeting, a very positive meeting for many different reasons. One reason was actually that this is our first in-person meeting for more than a year. So the reality is that for ministers, and especially for foreign ministers, to not be able to travel, that has really been difficult. But because we were able to also follow very strict or respect strict COVID-19 measures to prevent the spread of virus, we were able also to hold an in-person meeting over 2 days this week. And of course, perhaps the most important thing that was the message that Secretary Blinken conveyed to all of us, and that was that the United States is very committed to the transatlantic bond in NATO, the steadfast commitment to our collective defense clause, and the message from President Biden, which then Blinken expressed to us, that the new Biden administration is really looking into how they can rebuild alliances and also strengthening NATO. So that was a positive message, a message that was very much welcomed by all allies, and we are looking forward to also welcoming President Biden to the upcoming NATO Summit here in Brussels later on this year. And of course, we made some preparations. We discussed NATO 2030, Russia, but also the situation in Afghanistan. So we covered many topics in a very positive atmosphere, knowing that there are many problems, many challenges, but as long as we work together, North America and Europe, we are able to tackle all of them as a strong united alliance. So I think that was the main message from the meeting.
Thank you. We will pick up this idea of the transatlantic bond and how to strengthen it in a moment, but I want to turn to Russia. You mentioned Russia, and I'm the director of the Institute on Russia here at USF. So my question is, some have argued that NATO expansion has emboldened hardliners in Russia and convinced ordinary Russians that the West poses an existential threat to their country. Even some members of the Russian opposition, the democratic opposition, have expressed this view. What would you say to those who argue that NATO expansion has fueled Russian aggression? And what is your view regarding the expansion of NATO to include Georgia and Ukraine?
First of all, I really believe that just the idea that an expansion of NATO is a kind of threat or a provocation towards Russia is a very dangerous idea, and it's completely wrong. Because we have to understand that what we have done is that we have respected the free and independent choice of sovereign nations. After the end of the Cold War and the end of the Warsaw Pact, a lot of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, they got their freedom, they got the possibility to decide their own future themselves, and it is enshrined in many documents which are also subscribed to by Russia, that it is actually a sovereign right of every sovereign nation to choose their own path and to decide what kind of security arrangements, military alliance they want to be part of or not want to be part of. So it's the whole idea that NATO is, in a kind of aggressive way, is moving east is wrong. It is the countries in the east that has decided through democratic processes to join NATO. And for many years after the end of the Cold War, we actually were in the process of not only getting new members from East and Central Europe, the Poland, the Baltic countries, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, but we also gradually developed a more and more close partnership with Russia. I have attended many NATO summits, NATO meetings, where, for instance, President Putin, Prime Minister Medvedev have participated. It is Russia that has, stopped to, in a way, believe in the idea of working together, cooperating, trust each other, and that was partly triggered by the use of military force against Georgia in 2008, but even more so by the aggressive actions against Ukraine, where Russia illegally annexed Crimea and used military force against a neighbor, Ukraine, in 2014. For me, as a Norwegian, it is extremely important to underline the right of every nation to decide their own future and also whether they want to be part of a military alliance or not. Because back in 1949, there was a big discussion whether Norway should join NATO. And of course, at that time, the Soviet Union, our neighbor, Norway is bordering Russia, or before that, the Soviet Union. Of course, Joseph Stalin didn't like the idea of a neighbor, Norway, joining NATO. But we made our independent decision as a small country that we wanted to be part of NATO. And I'm very glad that in Washington or in London or in Paris, they didn't say that because Russia or Soviet Union dislike that Norway is joining, then we don't accept Norway as a member. And exactly the same idea should apply for the Baltic countries, for Poland, for all the others who have joined. They have decided to join, and it's only for NATO allies and the applicant country to decide whether NATO is going to enlarge or not. It's not for Russia. They have no say in this, and there is no way it is a provocation that sovereign nations make their own sovereign decisions. Then on Georgia and Ukraine, we stated in 2008, NATO, that at the summit in Bucharest, and I was there as Norwegian Prime Minister, that Georgia and Ukraine will become members of NATO. We didn't set any date for that. We have repeated that decision at summits after 2008. What we do now is that we help and support Ukraine and Georgia as they move towards membership. We help them with security sector reform, with strengthening democratic control of the armed forces to gradually meet NATO standards, and by doing that they are moving closer to NATO membership. But NATO membership has to be agreed by consensus. All allies have to agree, and therefore I'm not able to give you a date for when allies assess that Georgia and Ukraine are ready to fully join the alliance. So, well, my short answer is that it's not a provocation, it's not a threat to Russia that European countries have joined NATO in Central and Eastern Europe. We don't want to live in a world where big powers are establishing a sphere of influence where they decide what small neighbors can do. It's a sovereign democratic right, and the Baltic countries, the Eastern Europeans, have demonstrated that democratic right, and we have respected that.
Thank you, Secretary General, for being here. I know that much of what you talk about today will be a reflection of NATO 2030, your own sort of strategic initiative. As you sort of survey the coming decade and you're thinking about adapting to change, how does a big organization like NATO go about changing itself and sort of staying current and abreast of current threats?
So NATO is the most successful alliance in history for one reason, and that is that we have been able to change when the world is changing. After the Cold War, we totally changed what NATO did. We went into the Balkans and helped to end two ethnic wars there, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Serbia. We enlarged with many new members from Eastern and Central Europe. Then after the 9/11 attacks against the United States, we changed again. Suddenly NATO was at the forefront fighting international terrorism, and we have been there since then. And then after 2014, we changed because we saw more aggressive Russia, and we have implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense in a generation since 2014. We need to continue to change, continue to adapt, because the world is changing. We are faced with more cyber attacks, a more brutal form of terrorism with the rise of Daesh, proliferation of nuclear weapons, and we see also the global balance of power is shifting with the rise of China, and we see many other challenges, a much more complex security environment which we have to address. Therefore, we have put forward and launched what we call NATO 2030, which is a project to make NATO future-proof. It addresses a wide range of issues, how to strengthen our deterrence and defense, including by more NATO-funded budgets or funding for our deterrence and defense activities. It's about resilience, making sure that we have reliable infrastructure, telecommunications, power grids, and so on. Extremely important, because we see that we see more means of aggression against, for instance, our infrastructure than we have seen before. It's about technology, making sure that we maintain our technological edge. It's about building partnerships, also with partners in the Asia Pacific, addressing partly also the rise of China, protecting the rules-based order. It's about strengthening NATO as a training alliance, because we strongly believe that prevention is better than intervention. If we can train local forces, it also makes us more safe and secure. It's about strengthening NATO as a political alliance, consultations among allies, and it's also about renewing NATO's strategic concept and about taking into account the security consequences of global warming or climate change. All of this is in the NATO 2030 initiative. We discussed it at the Foreign Ministerial meeting this week. I sense very broad support. We will continue to discuss, negotiate, develop the proposals, and then I'm very confident that when President Biden and all the other NATO leaders meet in Brussels later on this year, they will agree bold, forward-looking conclusions on how to continue to strengthen NATO along these lines, which are now presented in the NATO 2030 project. So change is the key for NATO success, and therefore we need to continue to change.
Thank you. I've heard you say that the most important of it is the most difficult part of your job is managing the internal politics of a 30-member alliance. I'm sure, for example, if you have a meeting in Ankara one week, you're probably likely to have a meeting in Athens soon thereafter. How do you keep the alliance moving more or less, that everyone is moving in the same direction?
You're right that, of course, NATO being an alliance of 30 different countries with different geography, different history from both sides of the Atlantic, and always with different political parties in power, there are differences. That's in a kind of natural consequence of being 30 democracies. And we have seen some disagreements and differences between allies over decades. Back to the Suez Crisis in 1956, or when France decided in the 1960s to actually leave the military cooperation in NATO, and NATO had to move its headquarters from Paris to Brussels and Belgium, or the Iraq War in 2003, where some allies were heavily in favor of the intervention, others were heavily against. So we have seen differences between NATO allies before, and as we see them today. But the strength and the success of NATO is that we have been able to always unite around our core task and stay committed to protecting and defending each other based on NATO's core principle, one for all for one. If one ally is attacked, it is regarded as an attack on all allies. And I'm not saying this is easy, but I'm saying that the reason why NATO is able to make decisions, is able to function despite the differences, is that it is in the national security interest of each and every ally that we stand together. A strong NATO is good for Europe, but it's also good for the United States. It's a unique thing for the United States, the only big power in the world that actually has 29 friends and allies. We saw that after the attack on Afghanistan, the 9/11 attacks, where NATO allies invoked our Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, for the first time in our history to support the United States. And more than 100,000 soldiers from Europe, from Canada, from partner nations have served shoulder to shoulder with American soldiers in Afghanistan for 2 decades. And more than 1,000 have paid the ultimate price. This shows that NATO has been good also for the United States. In the light of the rise of China, it's good to have friends. So it is the security interests, the fact that we are stronger together than apart, that is the main reason why I am and all NATO allies are able to find consensus, find ways to create compromises, and then be able to make decisions despite the differences we see. So yes, it's not always easy. There are disagreements, I don't deny that, but it is very encouraging to see how the alliance is able to cope with the differences and then continue to move on.
Secretary General, we're going to pick up on this point that you made about Article 5. An attack on one ally is considered an attack on all allies. Our first question comes from a USF alum who has a question particularly on this notion of collective defense. You published a piece in the Tampa Bay Times this week where you mentioned that you visited MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa, home to U.S. Central Command and U.S. Special Operations Command. Our first audience question comes from a USF alum who works there. So let's listen.
My name is Curtis Burns, and I'm a 1997 recipient of a Master of Arts degree in history and an active duty Army commission from the University of South Florida. I've also served with NATO forces in Afghanistan and Europe over the course of my military career. Secretary General Stoltenberg and USF, thank you for the opportunity to ask a question on the important topic of NATO's future. My question is, given Russia's use of irregular warfare, such as disinformation, cyber attacks, the use of private military companies, and attacks involving nerve agents, all to advance its foreign policy goals, how does NATO interpret these activities in the context of collective defense? More specifically, do you anticipate Russia's continued use of irregular warfare will drive NATO to reevaluate the threshold of an Article 5 violation?
Thank you so much for your question. First of all, I would like to say that it was really a pleasure and great to visit the MacDill Air Force Base back in 2017, and also to meet with the U.S. Central Command and the U.S. Special Operations Command. Both these commands are, of course, providing extremely valuable support to different NATO missions and operations. I have seen U.S. Special Operation Forces in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and elsewhere, and of course, Central Command is of course key. In, for instance, the global coalition to defeat Daesh, where also NATO and NATO allies are participating. So Florida may be far away from some of the theaters where NATO troops are operating, but the commands we see there are critical and extremely important for NATO in many different ways. Then what you point at is something which is extremely important, and that is that before it was a very clear line between peace and war. It was either peace or war. Now there is a much more blurred line. We have disinformation campaigns, we have cyber attacks, we have economic coercion. We have many different kinds of intelligence operations. And we have seen NATO allies being subject for aggressive actions by other countries where they use not traditional military means, but all these non-military means to try to undermine us, divide us, attack us. And that's exactly what NATO has to adapt to, and what we actually have over some years now responded to by changing the way NATO is operating. For instance, in cyberspace, we have realized that cyber is a domain where we need to be present. And we have been there, of course, for several years, but we are constantly stepping up. And we decided not so many years ago that an attack in cyber, a cyber attack, may trigger Article 5. That's a totally new message, meaning that before we regard an armed attack as something that was battle tanks or planes or ships, but now we have stated clearly that cyber attacks could also trigger Article 5. So we need to be ready to respond also to attacks which are conducted with different means of aggressions, not only the traditional military means. I think also we need to realize that NATO has a lot to do even before we trigger Article 5 to counter disinformation, as we do every day, to protect critical infrastructure. So that's the reason why we are focusing on, in our NATO 2030 project, how can we develop more concrete targets for the resilience of airports, energy grids, telecommunications, 5G. We had a big debate about Huawei and 5G and so on. And again, technology and the other areas where we are working, broadening our security agenda. We will never give our adversaries, or our potential adversaries, the privilege of knowing exactly when we trigger Article 5. But what we have stated clearly is that we will trigger Article 5 when we find that necessary, and we can also trigger Article 5 when we see aggression conducted with other means than the normal military means.
Thank you. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin made a surprise visit to Afghanistan on Sunday, and this is at a time when the new administration is deciding whether to adhere to the previous administration's agreement with the Taliban to remove all U.S. forces from the country by May 1st. The U.S. and NATO have fought side by side in this conflict, so this is an issue on the minds of many, including one of our graduate students who experienced this conflict in his home country. I now turn to him for our next question. Let's listen.
Greetings, Mr. Stoltenberg, the Honorable Secretary General of NATO. My name is Murid Partau, and I'm a PhD student here at the School of Interdisciplinary Global Studies at the University of South Florida. I'm originally from Afghanistan, and I specialize in Middle Eastern and South Asian politics. My question is regarding NATO's mission in Afghanistan. As the US is currently withdrawing its forces and negotiating a political settlement with the Taliban, what's NATO's role in these negotiations? Will NATO and US withdraw together in case there is a decision of full withdrawal from the country, or will NATO countries stay the course and train and advise Afghan security forces and democratic government? Thank you.
First of all, NATO strongly supports the peace talks, and we also strongly support the renewed effort by the United States to re-energize, to reinvigorate the ongoing peace talks between Taliban and the Afghan government. These talks are not easy, and of course the whole process is fragile. And this was also very much addressed when foreign ministers met here in Brussels this week with also with, of course, Secretary Blinken. And we discussed how can we continue to support the difficult but important peace talks. But these talks, despite the fact that we don't have any guarantee for success, they are the only path to peace. They are the only way to achieve a lasting political solution in Afghanistan, preventing Afghanistan from again becoming a safe haven for international terrorists. And therefore, the renewed initiative is strongly supported by NATO allies. This is the first time Taliban and the Afghan government actually sit around the same table and negotiate. It has to be, and it is an Afghan-owned process. At the same time, the United States, NATO allies, of course, support the negotiating process, and we consult closely. We have our senior civilian representative, NATO senior civilian representative in Kabul. He has attended, been in Doha and followed the negotiations. And of course, allies are closely consulting as we try to re-energize the process. There will be a meeting in Istanbul, NATO ally, where all the parties are expected to come, and where we'll really make a new effort to try to get some concrete results. If we succeed, and if the Afghans succeed, because at the end of the day it has to be the Afghans that agree a peace deal for Afghanistan, then of course that will be a great achievement. But at the same time we have to be realistic, and there is of course a possibility that the peace process does not succeed. Then we are faced with a very difficult dilemma, because then we leave, but then we risk to jeopardize, to lose the gains we have made over 2 decades in Afghanistan, or we stay, but then we have to be prepared for a long-term continued military presence, also with increased violence. So again, we are back to the peace efforts. The message to all parties at the negotiating table is that they have to show a real willingness to make compromises, to negotiate in good faith, and we need to see the Taliban reduce violence, and we need also to see that the Taliban stop supporting international terrorists. I think we have to remember that now, the NATO presence in Afghanistan has changed a lot over the last years. Not so many years ago, we had more than 100,000 troops in the combat operation. Now there are roughly 10,000 troops in Afghanistan, NATO troops, international troops, and most of them are conducting training, assisting, support of the Afghan national security forces, which are on the front line. The Afghans are themselves on the front line. The majority of the NATO troops, the majority of the 10,000 troops in Afghanistan, they are non-US, showing the importance of close coordination, consultation in Afghanistan or among NATO allies regarding our future presence in Afghanistan. At the foreign ministerial meeting this week, it was clearly stated by all allies that as we now discuss our future presence there, we need to adhere to the principle we have established over some years, that we went into Afghanistan together, we have adjusted our presence there together, and when the time is right, we will leave together. So we need close coordination between allies. That's exactly what we do, and we will make decisions on our future presence there together based on the assessment of the peace negotiations and based on the conditions on the ground in Afghanistan.
We now have a question about China. This comes from one of the honor students in the Honors College here who actually studied abroad in China. Let's listen.
Hello, my name is Nobel Proenza from Tampa, Florida. I am a senior here at USF, graduating this semester. I am studying international studies and world languages and cultures with a double concentration in Mandarin Chinese and French. Thank you so much for allowing me to participate today. My question is, NATO was originally created to provide collective security against the Soviet Union, but has expanded to deal with a variety of security threats or issues. How does NATO respond or view the growing influence of China in Europe and in the Mediterranean? For example, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and China's Belt and Road Initiative expansion into Africa, Latin America, and other places with NATO influence. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for a very important and relevant question. I think we have to start with the following, and that is that NATO is a regional alliance, North America and Europe standing together, and we have been that for more than 70 years. And NATO will remain a regional alliance, North America and Europe. But the threats and the challenges we face in this region, they are becoming more and more global. International terrorism, cyber, proliferation of nuclear weapons, but also, of course, the rise of China, which is shifting the global balance of power. Soon China will have the biggest economy in the world. They already have the largest defense budget in the world, and they're investing heavily in new military capabilities, and they are also coming closer to us in cyberspace, in investing in our infrastructure, in Europe and also in other NATO allied countries. And we see them in the Arctic, we see them in Africa, so they are in many ways coming closer to us. The rise of China poses some opportunities for all of us. Economic growth, trade. The rise of China has helped to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And we need to work with China, engage with China on common challenges like, for instance, climate change. At the same time, we need to also realize the security consequences of the rise of China, because China is a power that doesn't share our values. We see how they treat minorities, the Uyghurs, in their own country. We see how they coerce neighbors in also close to their own borders, but also actually countries all over the world. We see how they are hampering, undermining freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, and so on. So that's the reason why NATO has to make sure that we, first of all, are engaging with China to address the concerns we have. Second, that we work with partners, that we establish a platform of like-minded democracies, standing up for rules-based orders, standing up for the values we believe in. And when we see that China is actually violating basic human rights, we need to call that out, as we have done, for instance, when it comes to their cracking down on democratic rights in Hong Kong. So this is again part of something which is reflecting that NATO is changing. For many years we were focused on the Soviet Union. Now we need to focus on a much more broad security spectrum of challenges. We remain a regional alliance, but in our region we need to respond to many more challenges than we did not so many decades ago.
Thank you. Another one of our honors college students has a question about genocide. Let's listen.
My name is Sam Marichek, and I am a sophomore student in the Judy Genschaft Honors College, studying political science, philosophy, and economics. Thank you for taking the time to share your wisdom with the University of South Florida community today. I am honored to have the opportunity to ask you a question about your work. My freshman year, I took a class by a leading genocide scholar at USF on the history and theory of genocide in international affairs. This class, as one could guess, is one I won't soon forget. Since taking it, however, I've kept up to date on news of genocide and suspected genocide around the globe. What realistic steps can NATO take to prevent genocide in China and around the world? Is it possible that Western recognition of its own past genocides in the West might create more momentum to act on this threat to the Uyghur populations in China? How can Western democracies build alliances against China? And what is NATO's role in that?
First of all, I think that European nations have, and NATO allies, the United States, all of us, have been very clear, for instance, on the genocide we saw during the Second World War, and we have stated very clearly many times that, of course, genocide is something which is absolutely unacceptable. It's violating international law. and we have been very clear on that. Second, I strongly believe that China's treatment of the Uyghurs is absolutely unacceptable. We have seen mass detentions, we have seen forced labor, and we also seen population control measures such as forced sterilization. So this is abhorrent, this is appalling, and it runs directly against the core values that NATO is founded on: democracy, rule of law, individual liberty, and the way China is dealing with minorities and human rights is absolutely violating those values. So this is a clear message from NATO allies, and there is no doubt where we stand on that issue.
So you said at the start of our program that NATO is the most successful alliance in history. Our next question concerns the health of the alliance. Let's listen.
Volcal Sabetta, and I'm from Tampa, Florida. I'm currently in my first semester in the master's program of political science with a concentration of American government, and I'm also expected to be graduating in 2022. Thank you so much for this opportunity and for answering all of our questions. Now, it was proposed that one of this year's goals will be to strengthen the bond between Europe and North America. My question is, what are going to be the active objectives in order to achieve this goal and improve the relations? Thank you so much.
Sorry, I didn't get to the last question. I must.
How would you? What are the goals of? How would you strengthen the alliance? What concrete measures would you take to strengthen the alliance?
Okay. Well, I think that the most important thing we do is that we do what we actually discussed also during the foreign ministerial meeting today, and that is to demonstrate that a strong NATO is good for all allies. To demonstrate that for European allies, of course, it is a great advantage that the United States, the strongest military power in the world, is providing them with security guarantees. And as long as all potential adversaries know that if they in any way attack a NATO ally, it will trigger a response from all allies. This is the best way to prevent conflict. NATO's task is not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent a conflict, and for European allies to have US and also Canada providing security guarantees, of course, is of great importance. And vice versa, because as I already alluded to, it is a great advantage for the United States to have so many friends and allies, not least in dealing with the shifting global balance of power with the rise of China, soon being the biggest economy in the world. The United States represents like 25% of the world's GDP and the world's economic power. But if you add the NATO allies, we together we represent 50% of the world's GDP, 50% of the world's military might, and close to 1 billion people. So it is a great advantage also for the United States to have NATO and so many friends and allies. And the best way to strengthen this alliance is to demonstrate the value of that, as we do in the fight against terrorism, in dealing with more assertive Russia, or in responding and acting when we see the rise of China. So that's in short the best way to answer your question.
Mr. Secretary General, we know that climate and its impact on global security is an issue that you care very much about and you've worked on for a long time, even before you were Prime Minister of Norway and served as UN Special Envoy for Climate Change. Climate change is an issue that our students also care about deeply, as evidenced by the next question. Let's listen.
My name is Mariah Bokus. I am currently a third-year student at the University of South Florida, and I am majoring in international studies with a minor in economics. My question is, how would climate change impact global security, and how will that affect the relationship between countries and international relations? In addition, is there anything that the world could do that hasn't been done already in order to limit the effects of climate change long-term? Thank you very much.
So climate change matters for our security. Climate change is a crisis multiplier. More extreme weather, global warming, rising sea levels will force people to move, will increase competition about scarce resources like water, land, and all of that will exacerbate a crisis, conflict many places in the world. So climate change matters for NATO because climate change matters for security. And I think that NATO has at least three important tasks. One is to be the leading organization in understanding, assessing, analyzing the link between climate change and a crisis, a military conflict. Second, NATO has an important role when it comes to adapting to climate change, because our military, they are operating out there in nature. And of course, when the sea level is rising, it will affect our naval bases and NATO infrastructure. When we see more extreme heat, for instance, as we have seen in Iraq over the last year, we saw many days with more than 50 degrees Celsius, which is extremely high, warm weather. I don't know what that is in Fahrenheit, but extremely warm. Then, of course, it matters for soldiers who are going to operate out there. So it is about uniforms, how we conduct our operations, vehicles. Everything has to function in more extreme weather. And melting of ice, of course, affect our operations in the high north. And lastly, we need to make sure that we also look into how the military can help contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases, how we actually can have less emissions from different military operations and activities. And we made an important step at our foreign ministerial meeting this week, where we agreed a report on how to integrate climate change into our planning, into our exercises, and also how to make sure that we have an assessment of the consequences of climate change for our security. So we are moving forward as an alliance. You asked me what is the most important thing. Well, the most important thing is that we all help to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, because that's the only way to reduce the effect of global warming.
Of course, Turkey has long been the sort of anchor for the southeastern part of the NATO region, but that's being challenged. And so we now have a question from another of our honor students about Turkey. Let's listen.
Senior political science student at USF St. Pete. Recently, we've seen Turkey make concerted efforts to improve its relations with Russia. Given that Turkey is such a strategic NATO member state, how do we incentivize Turkey to not further align itself with Russia?
Turkey is an important member of this alliance, not least because they border Iraq and Syria, and they have been extremely important in the fight against ISIS, liberating the territory ISIS controlled in Iraq and Syria not so many months ago. At the same time, there are serious concerns expressed by allies, for instance, on the Turkish decision to acquire a Russian air defense system, S-400, and I have expressed concerns about the consequences of that decision. The United States have done it, and we also have other issues in the Eastern Mediterranean, and where we see differences and concerns expressed by allies. I think that what NATO does is that we provide a platform for when we disagree and when there are differences between allies to sit down, to discuss, consult, and try to find ways to reduce tensions, differences, and sometimes also solve the underlying issues. We have discussed, of course, the S-400 many times. We have been able to make some progress on the Eastern Mediterranean, where we have been able to establish what we call a deconfliction mechanism here at NATO, and we'll continue to use NATO as the platform for allies to try to look for ways to address the differences we see. Turkey remains a committed ally, but there are differences, and as I've alluded to or already talked about, differences between allies is nothing new, but NATO has proven to be extremely capable of dealing with differences, and absolutely certain we are able to do that also now.
We have a lot of students on the call today, and many of them are interested in careers in the Foreign Service or with international organizations, and I'm sure they would appreciate your advice or any insights you have. Let's listen to a question.
Hello, my name is Viveka Lakwani. I am from St. Thomas, one of the 3 U.S. Virgin Islands. I am a USF senior majoring in international studies and minoring in intelligence studies with a plan of graduating this year in the fall of 2021. My question for you, Mr. Stoltenberg, is what would you suggest to a new graduate who is interested in a career in foreign affairs? Their qualities, their experience, what should they possess in order to make themselves stand out? Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I don't know to what extent I really have any good advice to give you, because I have never made so many plans for my career. I actually only made one decision when I was in my early 20s, and that was that I was not going to become a politician. So actually I went into economics and statistics, and I worked as a researcher in the Norwegian Central Bureau of Statistics for some years, because I was very much oriented towards mathematics and economics. And then suddenly I was asked to become the deputy Minister for Environment, and I promised myself and my wife that I would only be in politics for a few years and then go back to research. But then things happened. I ended up in politics, and then I was in Norwegian politics, and I didn't dream about becoming a Secretary General of NATO, but after I stepped down as Prime Minister, suddenly that was an opportunity. So I have never been able to plan my career, and it has gone in different directions over the years. So, but if there's anything I would like to say, then it is that focus on the work, the job you have today, and be focused on how can you do that as good as possible. So for the students, just do your homework, study hard, and be focused on that. And for those who have started in a new job, be focused on delivering good results in the job you have. I think sometimes it's a bit dangerous to think too much about the next job, because then you are less focused on where you are. And if you are delivering good in the work or the position or the job you have today, I'm absolutely certain that there will be some new opportunities in the future. So stay focused, work hard on the responsibilities you have, and then something nice will happen.
Thank you so much. I want to ask one other question. We are running short on time, but I think we have a little bit of time for a couple more questions. Today, March 25th, is the 200th anniversary of Greek independence. So I wanted to ask you a question about Greece on this bicentennial. You just talked about the tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean. Greece has accused Turkey of gas exploration in its waters and making territorial claims. These tensions are probably the worst among any two NATO allies. How do you mitigate these tensions? You talked about some of the response to that NATO has made, but what more can you say about how NATO can defend Greece's territorial sovereignty?
So you are absolutely right that those tensions are perhaps the most difficult tensions between two NATO allies, not only because there are serious differences, tensions, but also because they have been there for so many years. I have expressed my concerns both in Ankara and in other capitals, but I think also what NATO is doing is that at least we are bringing the parties together. And one of the concerns we had, especially a few months ago, was the risk for any military accidents in the Eastern Mediterranean, because with significantly increased military presence of Turkey and Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean, with planes, ships, submarines, there was and high tensions. It was a real risk for military incidents. As we have seen, for instance, back in the 1990s, where actually those incidents led to casualties, downing of planes, and casualties. It was extremely, and still is extremely important for NATO to prevent this from happening again. And that's the reason why we used the NATO platform. We brought together Greece and Turkey, established what we call a deconfliction mechanism, also very operative lines of communications, direct lines of communications, 24/7, some agreed procedures. Greece and Turkey also agreed to reduce tensions by cancelling some exercises. We still work on how we can expand this mechanism for deconflicting between two allies in East and Med. And we welcome the progress we have seen. There is less military presence, less tension. It's not solved, but at least the tensions have been reduced. And this has also helped to pave the way for what is called exploratory talks between Greece and Turkey on the underlying disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean. We also have a NATO presence in the Aegean. We have something called the Aegean activity, and that is NATO ships sailing there to help to implement the agreement between Turkey and Greece on the migration challenges in the Aegean. And that NATO presence is important because it actually brings together Turkey and Greece, Turkey and the European Union, Frontex, their border agency. And again, I think just the fact that we bring them together is at least one important step in the right direction. So, since NATO is an organization based on consensus, when allies disagree, that makes it hard for us to make decisions. But at least we can be a tool, a vehicle for trying to find solutions, either to solve the whole underlying dispute or problem, if we have that between allies, and or at least reduce tensions and prevent the situation from escalating and coming out of control. And that's exactly what we do when two valued allies, important allies, Greece and Turkey, have some tensions and some difficulties, as we see, for instance, in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Thank you so much, Mr. Secretary General. I think we're out of time, sadly. We thank you so much for joining us and for your generous and thoughtful questions. We all learned so much. It was a distinct honor to host you at USF.
Again, thank you so much. It has been a great privilege to be together with you and to listen to all the very relevant and important questions. And I wish you all the best and hope to see you in person at some stage when we can start to travel again. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you.